colleagues, Deb Parkinson and Claire Zara. Thank you.
That was unexpected.
Good time for a pay rise.
In this 21st century, we will live with more frequent extreme weather events, and while the disasters may be inevitable, damage to people and relationships can be mitigated. In 1976, after the Buffalo Creek flood in the US, sociologist Kai Erikson wrote, "The community, what remains of it, seems to have lost its most significant quality, the power it gave to people to care for one another in moments of need, to console one another in moments of distress, and to protect one another in moments of danger." In the 40 years since, the human experience of disasters has been investigated, and in Australia the concept of community resilience foregrounded. However, a gender lens on disaster experience is now gaining ground in Australian research, and today we welcome Christine Erickson and Connie Kellett and Catherine Haynes, who I think are all here today. The experiences of the 32 men who informed this new research, Men on Black Saturday, have much to add to the discourse on disasters and their social impacts. Critically, the research exposed myths about men, including that men won't talk. In fact, men quickly responded to the invitation to participate and spoke openly and generously. Learning from these men and from gender and disaster researchers will contribute to the health and well-being of individuals and communities, and thereby advance the outcomes sought by COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, in their disaster resilience strategy. In this same venue, in March last year, we held the first national conference on natural disasters and domestic violence, and reported on the narratives of 47 workers and 29 women. In some of those interviews, we sat with women who were deeply worried about their men and women who had been hurt by them. As Madeline said, the concept of "I am a man and I can do" has been defeated in so many men. Things they couldn't do and they couldn't be, and so much was lost. At that conference and related speaking events throughout Victoria, we were constantly asked, but what about the men? After an invitation from Emeritus Professor Frank Archer, we formed a partnership with Monash Injury Research Institute and were funded by the National Disaster Resilience Grant Scheme. That was to begin to answer this question, particularly as it related to harmful behaviours of men, both to themselves and to people around them. It was also to engage it was also about men's apparent unwillingness to engage with support services and their unwillingness to seek help even from people around them. The research methodology was qualitative, inviting men who were affected by Black Saturday in the shires of Mitchell and Murrindindi to be interviewed about their experiences, reflections and feelings. Ethics approval was received from both Monash University and North East Health Human Ethics Research Committees. The sample of 32 was self-selected, aged 36 to 69, medium of 14 years in residence. 12 were experienced firefighters or CFA or SES volunteers. 2/3 of the men were in settled relationships on Black Saturday. About a third of the men described these as very dedicated, loving and committed relationships. For some, however, relationships deteriorated, and 4 had separated by the time of the interview. One man said only 3 couples were still together from his friendship network of 16 couples.
This report conveys the insights of these men, insights that, if acted on, have the potential to reduce the harm that follows natural disasters. This kind of report is rare in the disaster literature in Australia and in the whole world. The interviews confirmed that the effects of catastrophic disaster on men reach far into the future, with increased violence, alcohol and drug consumption, mental health issues and suicide often hidden from view. 4 years on, some men have become reclusive, Some have never regained employment or financial security, and many are still living and reliving the emotions provoked by the disaster, including anger and aggression at others and at the authorities. The focus of this presentation will be on the most challenging and distinctive aspect of the research findings, that gender norms are more pronounced after disaster and can harm both men and women. Deeper solutions to the long-term suffering of men, women and children affected by catastrophic disaster will only follow examination and action on gendered expectations.
Disaster writer Duke Austin wrote that the legacy of disasters for men may be a feeling of inadequacy at having failed to meet the expectations of manhood. The 32 men, too, pointed to the impossibility of living up to the prescribed role of men of providing and protecting.
Edward said, "We were putting out fires around the place, and then the fire came in through the east side. There was one moment where I thought, oh geez, I've killed my whole family." And Dean said, "Well, there's that typical male thing that you've got to be the provider and you can't. You've failed in your duties to protect your property, your family." Everybody felt helpless. And Rod, "Every man thinks there are expectations on men to stand up and be brave and be the stalwarts of the family and all those Aussie ochre images. Instead, I think a lot of people were absolutely shit scared."
Others too commented on the disparity between expectation and feeling.
And Adam said, "Men are supposed to have some sort of masculine, paternal role in managing any sort of situation, where when the fire starts you just flick the switch and become robotic. And I don't think you're meant to have feelings." And Todd said, "Macho, tough, we can handle it. We look after the women folk." It's bullshit, of course.
There was a sharp distinction between before and after the firestorm. Innocence pervaded the men's narratives of going in, feeling prepared, ready to do the job they'd so often trained for. Too soon, their experiences of the firestorm destroyed any semblance of control.
"I thought we had protection, and I was just kidding myself," said Patrick.
There is an intrinsic contradiction for members of top-down traditional command and control organisations to be so clearly out of control and at the mercy of the firestorm that raged on Black Saturday. An SES volunteer said, "With
SES events, we're always in control of a situation, but with what happened to me, I wasn't in control, and that was probably the hardest thing I've had to deal with, that I had no control over what was happening to me."
Lee spoke of his terror and panic, scrambling to the fire truck parked in the driveway, fighting conditions of zero visibility, fearing for his elderly father and teenage son who were following. The fire truck was in survival mode, bunkered down with flashing lights on, horns sounding and silver fire shields down. Lee said,
"The driver poked his head out of the window and said, 'We're going to die here.' The local fire station had said, 'We're not coming up there to get you, it's not safe.' The crew declared a mayday when the comms said, 'No, no one's coming up there to get you. We just didn't think we were going to get out of there.' The truck driver was crying."
Stewart spoke of one of the crew leaders who lost the plot, just totally lost it, when having to drive through the fire front. He was screaming and yelling and crying. Surreal was one word that seemed to capture the enormity and unreality of the day. Apocalyptic was another. Edward said,
"That's what it was like. That's what the landscape was like. Just charred landscape full of dead bodies and burnt out cars, fallen down buildings."
On Black Saturday, Lou found a dying woman in a burnt-out car, her 2 small children dead in the back seat. His recollection of the scene is distorted in his nightmares.
"This is my silly brain turning something that was bad enough, then fighting me, because I suppose this is guilt. I keep saying, and it's very important, if only." And Chris said, "I started coming across bodies everywhere. Of 36 bodies, I think I ended up finding 24.
And Gerald spoke of being haunted by the images he saw.
"I should have just stuck my head up my bum and put a wet towel over my head and not witnessed nothing. But I had a job to do, and I just didn't think that it would affect me that much. I wouldn't do it again. I've always been strong-minded, and I don't scare easily, but that scared the shit out of me.
The effect on many of the men was of being shaken to their core. Their bodies overcame gender conditioning as they spoke of publicly crying in the face of such immense fear and tragedy. Aaron said,
I sat and cried on the footpath, and an old fellow came out of his house to see if I was all right. Before that, I wasn't someone who showed emotion. It just got to me. I could frighten people with my emotions you can't control.
Others too were aware that people found their expression of emotion frightening and unexpected. Adam said,
When it first happened, I can still remember going back to the office, and one of my mates was there. He and I had been on the crew, and he said, What the hell's wrong with you? And I just exploded into tears. Lee said, A simple question like, Where do you live? And I burst into tears. I've never done that before in my life. And Matthew, going past rows of burnt homes. I just broke out in tears.
Catastrophic disasters test men's ability to live up to the impossible. Men were expected to measure up to the firestorm in their behaviour and not to break down in its aftermath. They were expected to be brave, heroic, decisive, unemotional and stoic. Without the disaster of Black Saturday, many of the men interviewed would not have been propelled into the situations of powerlessness they described. Most had never been viewed as a victim in any aspect of their life before the fires, nor relied on others for the basics of life. Their loss of control during the fire lived on in continuing loss of control afterwards.
Paul explained, people were at a very different place than they were 6 months prior in how their relationship unfolded. Their emotional status, all the different stresses they faced of being unemployed, of being homeless, of grieving lost friends and family, all of those different things that are high on your normal stress list, but all compounding and all happening together.
Add to this a recovery process described as overlooking local knowledge and expertise and smothering the initiative shown by residents in the early days. The enormous task of the clean-up, for example, was controversial. Grocon's inflexible employment practices demanded 10-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week. Local people, with the complex and unrelenting pressures of rebuilding a life in communities devastated by trauma, were practically and emotionally ill-equipped for such a workload away from their own properties and families. Few locals benefited. Brad described the effect.
Disempowered, disenfranchised. People who needed the work after the disaster, both for financial reasons and for emotional, psychological recovery reasons, weren't getting the work. And yet, they were sitting here in their town watching all these trucks track from all over the place every day with outside contractors coming to do all the work.
Many men interviewed spoke of this in terms of the ultimate insult. It was their backyard and they were overlooked as potential paid employees. Instead, they watched helplessly, polishing their asses, as other men from outside did their clean-up. Scott indicated the bitterness of men sidelined in this way.
Oh no, you stand back out of the way. We'll bring other people in from outside. Grocon, they need the money. Better help them out. Yeah, get people who've got nothing to do with this area, off the stupid pipeline project, off some mine project, somewhere else. And Paul said, I wasn't able to get any full-time employment in the aftermath of the fires. I lost my business and our source of income. They were unprecedented economic opportunities that pretty much all went elsewhere, and this is one of the reasons I think that men have got very, very pissed off.
Those interviewed imagined a better way the clean-up could have been managed, with a supported and gradual return to work for both men and women. And like the Australian Human Rights Commission, we see a shared responsibility for children coexisting with this. Instead, there was a culturally ingrained policing of the convention of males as breadwinners, providing for the family, despite the evidence of women's workplace participation. Bernard told of the barrage of questions he faced regularly.
Why haven't you got it together? Why haven't you got your garden fixed? Why haven't you got your house done yet? What are you doing with your life? Why haven't you gone back to work? Why haven't you? And Edward said, expectations? Okay. To get things back to normal, to make things better, to rebuild, and I think to appear effective. And Christ, the men really needed to appear as if they were effective, productive, constructive members of the community.
Equally, there was a policing of male behaviour for men in emergency services, with consequences for not coping. Those men who'd not been able to present a convincing and long-lasting appearance of getting on with things, men who let the trauma of the day and the tragedy of events get to them, were somehow relegated to a lesser status. They were apparently judged as not quite measuring up to the hegemonic masculinity that characterises emergency services. Despite the absurdity of this expectation on a day like Black Saturday and its aftermath marked by chaos and grief, the stigma affected future prospects within emergency service organisations.
Stuart said, when the works coordinator was away, I used to be on higher duties. But when I took that month off, which I took off as stress leave, ever since, there's been nothing.
And Matthew wondered about the consequences of taking up counselling through his organisation.
People would be worried about confidentiality, whether there was any feedback that came round the back saying, keep this guy away from big fires.
Rather than provide effective support, employing bodies often fail to offer accessible and personal debriefing or ongoing and confidential access to counselling. Alternative work roles were rarely an option. Organisational responses suggested that men who needed help as a result of their emergency management role were perhaps not really suited to the role and could be removed, rather than seeing their circumstances as worthy of attention and likely to happen to anyone. The stigma associated with seeking counselling and men's reluctance to talk about either the trauma or their treatment emerged as a really strong theme, so much so that the panel after lunch will be discussing this. The men in this research too spoke of a range of physical injuries they sustained in the fires and their aftermath: lead poisoning, burns, burnt eyeballs, back problems, heart palpitations. They described exhaustion and trauma. There were consequences to mental and emotional health too. The men described anxiety and depression.
Carl said, I can feel myself getting into this depressive state and see how the world's against me. And Luke asked, where do you go? What do you do as a bloke? You're meant to be the tough, strong one, aren't you? I think when you say depressed, it means that you're weak, mentally weak, I suspect.
Others conveyed a sense of separation from themselves and their lives.
Gerald told us, I probably pinched myself hard every day for 7 months because every time I woke up, I thought this was a dream and I thought that I was just a ghost. I just didn't see anyone for weeks after the fires. And Luke said, yesterday I had a whole episode of being in a world I wasn't in. My life was going on and I wasn't even in it. And then Eric, doing all right. That's what I keep saying it, because if you don't keep saying it to yourself, you'll end up hanging on the end of a rope.
4 different men, had said that they'd felt suicidal. We haven't given the names for these quotes for confidentiality.
And they told us, I'm pretty vulnerable. I've got a history of suicide in my family on both sides, so I've had a determination to fight that. But I found that when I was really negative, when it got that bad, I couldn't find a way of telling anyone. And, well, when we went back to work and everything had settled, I haven't told my wife this. Anyway, I came home and I was just sitting in the car out there. Nothing was built, and I just felt like hanging myself. So I just sat there. You are the only 2 I've told.
I've told no one else. 2 men referred to killing others as well as themselves.
I was lucky enough to be seen at the right time, otherwise I would have done stupid things to myself or to other people. When you're in a suicidal, homicidal state, you really haven't got many tools to keep you on a level field. And another man said, there have been very, very many times when I've certainly thought about ending it all, and "This is just not worth it," or "How many people can I kill?" I'm quite happy for it to be on the record. I felt very suicidal on very many occasions, especially that period 2010, 2011, 2012. To get up in the morning and think to yourself, why am I bothering to do this? What's left? Because there's nothing left.
The men observed other men getting on with things, but seeming sad and not talking about things, not complaining, suffering in silence, keeping it to themselves. Another spoke of going into his cave. There was pressure to get over the fires, and men spoke of throwing themselves into work or distractions, going silent, thereby appearing to cope and still inhabiting a prescribed and acceptable masculinity. They described avoiding certain conversations, avoiding certain people, even becoming reclusive, so as not to have to express their feelings about what happened on Black Saturday and risk breaking down. As Cliff said,
"There's that stigma and expectation as a man. There's too much at stake."
Several men described being ashamed of their emotions. Rod said,
"I feel it's quite stupid of me to be showing such emotion even after all this time. You've got to get over it, don't you? I'm sure that a woman could get away with it a lot easier than a man." And Bill, "Years ago I would have told you to pull your socks up and just get on with life. And I think a lot of men have done that. They've tried to keep it together and not show emotion."
One man mentioned the ironic saying, "Tell someone who cares," neatly capturing the rules for behaviour that he had internalised. For some men, the pain too was internalised, emerging through physical manifestations. Todd told us about a man he knew.
"He had this big rash here, the same as me, and he's in his 30s. As soon as I saw it, I said, 'Stress.' He said, 'What are you talking about, stress? Bullshit, I don't suffer stress.'"
In living up to the masculine script, men were denied opportunities to express their feelings. The latitude for anger, however, was much greater than for tears. Physical violence and aggression is often associated with masculine behaviour and even rewarded publicly and politically. The men described it as a feature of the aftermath, including in public meetings and in committees established for the reconstruction. In families too, aggression and violence increased, triggered, though not caused, by the disaster. After all, only some men choose violence. Two men spoke with a depth of feeling about domestic violence. Rod told of his efforts to protect his daughter and grandchildren.
"The police were called on numerous occasions. The police were very understanding, much more so than I think he perhaps deserved. We thought he might top the lot of them. There were times I felt threatened because he's built like a brick toilet, and I was always aware that if he did decide to take a swing, there'd be absolutely no question that he'd flatten me with one punch."
And Paul referred to his street replete with domestic violence and of his frustration with the lack of intervention from police and community services, noting in particular an 8-week gap between referral and response to the violence. Our research with women exposed gendered expectations of them that they would sacrifice their own well-being for the greater good. Women had to pull back to a supportive, wifely, nurturing role, sometimes forfeiting the right to live free from violence. And this research reveals that men had to be stoic, protect and provide, and that this role, impossible it was after Black Saturday, was both compulsory and policed by societal institutions and by community members. Many men in this research regretfully described what they saw as their failure to live up to the ideal male role, not realising that few men ever do.
This report is an important step in formalising what many of us know anecdotally, that men and women suffer disaster impacts differently and continue to suffer long into the future. It particularly addresses the experiences and needs of men and links them to damaging and pervasive effects of gender expectations. Relying on popular and perhaps convenient assumptions that men don't talk and don't engage in services lets us off the hook for the harder questions. How can you, in your role, take gender into account in planning for disaster? As the men explained, the way disaster response and recovery is managed can have negative effects that not only compound those of the actual disaster, but result in long-term anger, frustration, and sometimes violent and destructive behaviours. What can you do to act on the insights of these men so that future disaster management does not repeat the mistake of making a terrible situation worse? There is no one-size-fits-all, nor is there a right time, as we found 4 years after the event, where some men were surprised to find strong emotions surfacing during our interviews, and surprised to find that they were not the only ones still affected by the events. What needs to change for men to feel safe in speaking about their feelings? What alternatives are there to talking? And what are the right questions to ask?
The recommendations that emerge from the research fall into 4 core groups and will be explored in the workshops. Neil Comrie, charged with monitoring the implementation of the 67 recommendations from the Royal Commission, warns against Victoria's complacency as Black Saturday becomes a historical event for those not involved in it. Both he and the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience state that we need to learn from previous disasters and that building resilience requires sustained behavioural change across entire communities. The chaos of catastrophic disaster not only magnifies what's good and bad in society, but also offers a chance for change, which may be regressive or positive. Major cultural changes have been achieved in road safety and smoking, and over the past 50 years, we've been part of a cultural revolution in regard to women's role and gay rights. It's possible to effect change in how we structure society to benefit both men and women. And just finishing on one of the men's comments, greater gender equality will relieve men of the expectations associated with these unrealistic models of masculinity.
Thank you.